people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. My name is Anthea Hancox, and I'm very proud to be the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, Australia's preeminent independent research institute solely dedicated to the study and interpretation of social cohesion. Many of you will be familiar with our internationally recognised Mapping Social Cohesion research study. This ongoing comprehensive survey and report is now authored by lead researcher Dr. James O'Donnell. Dr. O'Donnell is also the lead researcher and primary author of the Australian Cohesion Index. James, in putting together this report for you today, was supported by a great team, including Trish Prentice, Reuven Link, and Ching Kwan. An extensive program of interviews was also conducted to add greater breadth to the interpretation. And in addition, Peter Mayers introduces the report through a considered essay on Australia Today. And in addition, we've involved 4 exceptional experts to provide more depth. And I'm really pleased that 2 of them can be with us today. I'm immensely proud of this report. We've endeavoured to make the extensive data that informs it as accessible, clear, and practical as possible. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. O'Donnell here to provide an overview of the report. And we'll then welcome 2 of those experts from the report, Professor Kate Reynolds and Dr. Kudzai Kanhutu. As you listen to the discussion, please feel free to log any questions through the chat function, and we will attempt to get through as many of them as possible before we're joined by Minister Andrew Giles at the conclusion of the event. So right now, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Dr. James O'Donnell to kick off the session. Thanks, James.
Thank you, Anthea. Let me share my slides. So there was a moment in August 2023 when Australia appeared united. It seemed the entire nation was wheeling on the Matildas in their unprecedented march to the Football World Cup semi-finals. Perhaps this was entertainment to distract us from more pressing concerns. More optimistically, that sudden burst of shared enthusiasm for our national football team showed Australians see themselves as connected to one another and sharing a common destiny. So begins Peter Mayer's introductory essay to the Australian Cohesion Index 2023. Peter Mayer's author, journalist, and researcher. Now, it has been a challenging few years for Australia. Since the end of 2019, we've experienced bushfires, COVID-19, floods, a cost of living crises, seemingly without respite, and in the midst of a world struggling with geopolitical tension and conflict. And as I speak, we're engaged in a difficult debate over the voice referendum, all of which puts pressure on Australian society, our connections to others, our sense of belonging and trust, and our engagement and participation in community and civic life. That's not to say we're not connected as a society. Indeed, our social cohesion is resilient, but it is also fragile. And that's the context in which we launched the Australian Cohesion Index 2023. So I am James O'Donnell. I'm a demographer and lecturer at the Australian National University and one of the authors of this year's report. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. The report we launched today compiles and presents information from a wide variety of sources to inform our social and economic progress over the last 15 years. The report combines quantitative data with commentaries from 5 prominent experts, 53 qualitative interviews with people who have migrated to Australia over the years, and existing national and international research in these fields. The report combines 4 essays addressing 4 cross-cutting themes: trust in society, belonging and engagement, economic and material well-being, and Australia's health and well-being. On each of these themes, we explain how attitudes and perceptions of social cohesion in Australia are connected to substantive outcomes, behaviours and experiences across 10 domains of the Australian Cohesion Index. The report ends with a quantitative assessment of our progress on each domain and estimates of social cohesion in local government areas. These are the 10 domains of the Australian Cohesion Index. The index, developed and led by Professor Andrew Marcus in partnership between the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute and the Department of Home Affairs in 2021. This, the second iteration of the Australian Cohesion Index provides a critical barometer of the health, well-being and connectedness of Australian society. The Australian Cohesion Index sits alongside and complements the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's annual Mapping Social Cohesion study and the Australian government's recently released Measuring What Matters Wellbeing framework, providing a bridge in our understanding of the cohesiveness of Australian society and key social, economic, political and health outcomes. 5 of the domains are taken directly from the Mapping Social Cohesion study, and specifically the Scanlon Monash Index of Social Cohesion. So these are belonging, worth, social inclusion and justice, political engagement, and acceptance. These reflect the attitudes, perceptions, experiences, and behaviours that hold together Australian society. These are complemented by 5 domains that reflect substantive personal and social outcomes and tracks our national progress on incomes and wealth, employment, health, education, and participation in our communities. Let's now explore some of these findings. Our first essay is on the theme of trust in society, combining insights from our social inclusion and justice and political action domains. Now, trust is critical, the foundation of our social cohesion and collective well-being. Trust and a sense of belonging provide the core ingredients for our engagement in society and the economy, and connections and friendships within our communities. CEO of the Grattan Institute, Danielle Wood, provides expert commentary for this chapter, explaining that at the societal level, trust is the political capital that our leaders draw on to make hard policy decisions. The mutual trust between people and government is the foundation of our ability to achieve collective goals and tackle the major challenges in society. Trust in Australia, though, is fragile. Over the course of the 2010s, fewer than 1 in 3 people believe the federal government could be trusted to do the right thing by the Australian people all or most of the time. Larger numbers believe that people generally can be trusted, though we're very evenly split between those who think people can be trusted and those who think you can't be too careful with people. On both trust in people and in government, we're typically positioned at or sometimes below the average of other developed countries. Encouragingly, both trust in people and in government increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our collective response to the pandemic had a galvanizing effect, and we were substantially more likely to trust one another and governments, both state and federal. The effect has not fully worn off yet, but it has been declining since. In the 2022 Mapping Social Cohesion survey, distrust and cynicism was common, with most believing leaders abuse their powers at least some of the time, and most believing that minor or major changes to our political system are required. We will remain engaged, though, in Australia's democracy. Here is a summary of indicators on the political action domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. So half of us have signed a petition in the last 3 years, 1 in 5 have written or spoken to an MP, 1 in 6 have joined a boycott, and 1 in 10 a protest, march or demonstration. Most of these have been reasonably stable or have increased over time. Now, you may reasonably assume that such political activism is polarising, divisive, or even detrimental to social cohesion. But such activism is in fact central to our democracy. In an open and free democracy, is it better for us to stay home feeling either helpless and marginalised, or conversely content and happy to place blind faith in our leaders, or to take steps to protect and enhance our collective way of life? Whichever way you look at it, trust, the pursuit of social justice, and the belief that we can change for the better is foundational to our social cohesion. Our second cross-cutting theme is belonging and engagement. And belonging is the sense to which we feel connected to other people, places, and collective experiences. To belong is to have a place in the world, to feel a part of the communities and societies around us, and is critical to our identity and self-perception. Professor Kate Reynolds writes an expert commentary for this chapter: belonging is fundamental to being human. It drives our personal and collective well-being, our sense of worth, our participation, and our health. Now, Australians have traditionally felt a strong sense of pride and belonging, at least by international comparison, but this appears to be declining over time. Here are indicators on the belonging domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. On the Mapping Social Cohesion survey, the proportion of people who say they have a great sense of belonging in Australia declined by approximately 27% between 2007 and 2022. The proportion who take great pride in the Australian way of life and culture declined by 22%. There is some evidence to suggest that volunteering too, participation in social, community and civic groups, has also been declining. According to data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics General Social Survey, The proportion of people who volunteered through an organisation in the previous 12 months declined by 27% between 2006 and 2020. Combining data from the General Social Survey and the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, the proportion involved in social groups such as sports, religious and ethnic groups is estimated to have declined by 35% between 2006 and 2022, while the proportion involved in community support groups such as Rotary, Lions, the Australian Red Cross and the SES declined by 28%. Now, we don't expect all Australians will have equally high levels of belonging and engagement. Our newest Australians who have migrated here in particular require time to develop their social connections and roots within their communities. So belonging and engagement is an important part of the integration process for migrant Australians. And as theory and research demonstrates, it is incumbent on all Australians to support that process, to provide psychological and practical support and a welcoming community that helps people to maintain their cultural identities while growing into their new Australian identities. This table shows the key indicators on the acceptance domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. What this shows, and what is also emerging from the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, is that the value we see in multiculturalism and diversity is a great asset to Australia. We're increasingly likely to think that multiculturalism and ethnic diversity is good for Australia, it's good for our society, our culture, and our economy. However, the experience of discrimination, especially based on skin colour, ethnic origin, and religion, is also more common than it was. And addressing prejudice and discrimination sits within the broader challenge of strengthening Australian identity and belonging, especially in such a diverse society. And while we expect the strength of national pride and belonging to ebb and flow with social, cultural, and generational change, we must nevertheless ensure that all Australians have the opportunity to develop a sense of place and community, however they define it. This is important for who we are as humans, for our personal well-being, and for the vitality and connectedness of our communities and society. Economic and material well-being is the topic of our third essay. Cost of living pressures has been one of the major issues of the last 2 years. Rising inflation, increasing interest rates, and slow growing incomes place pressure on household finances and bring the economy to the front of people's minds and their concerns. Economic pressures and inequalities are multi-dimensional issues, affecting not just our material well-being, but also our collective well-being and social cohesion. As Professor Guai Lim notes in expert commentary for this chapter, recent experiences challenge us to think about how we can create inclusive and sustainable economic growth, not only for economic benefit or even just to ensure a degree of equity and fairness, but also for our very social fabric, our social cohesion, our collective well-being, everything that holds us together as a society. Here is a summary of indicators on the income and wealth domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. The economy has been resilient, though incomes and standards of living grew slowly in the 2010s. We had a great deal of volatility in GDP per person in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, very slow growth in 2022, and declining GDP per person in the first half of 2023. Official data suggests income and wealth inequality and relative poverty were reasonably stable or declined through the 2010s, though this comes after a period of increasing inequality. Rental affordability worsened across the early mid-2010s, and while we await more data, we expect the experience of rent affordability stress has become more common since 2021. Since COVID, the labour market has been strong. Unemployment rates have dropped below 4% in the last couple of years. Participation in the labour market among 15 to 64-year-olds is higher than it has ever been recorded, reaching above 80% in 2022. Underemployment, or the extent to which people are not working as much as they would like or need, was a little bit higher in 2022 than it was in 2008. In more recent years, though, underemployment has also been declining. We are more concerned with economic inequality and social inclusion in Australia. In 2022, 81% of people agreed that the gap between high and low income earners was too large. And while most of us still believe that Australia provides economic opportunities for those who work hard, this proportion is declining by 12% since 2007. In the here and now, financial pressures are biting. Cost of living pressures are contributing to financial stress and hardships. The proportion of people struggling, poor, or just getting along increased from 34% in 2020 to 41% in 2022, translating into a range of sacrifices and hardships. And since then, since 2022, financial stress has worsened. To our final theme, Australia's health and well-being, We are a lucky country and a healthy country. We have important health inequalities, though. Mental health is an ongoing issue across Australian society. And as Dr. Kanutu notes in expert commentary for this chapter, access to appropriate and sensitive support and services is a key public and community challenge, particularly for meeting the needs of our diverse society. Here is a summary of progress on the health domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. Life expectancy has steadily increased over the last 15 years. Most strikingly, Australia bucked the international trend in recording increased life expectancy during 2021 and 2020 during COVID-19, and fewer deaths than would normally be expected. Around 85% of us think our health is pretty good, if not very good or excellent, and we're less likely to smoke and drink alcohol to dangerous levels. However, mental health and well-being, negatively impacted during the pandemic, continues to be a major challenge for Australia. The 22% deterioration in psychological well-being between 2007-8 and 2020-21 is very much related to COVID. But there is still some work to ensure we don't see a permanent increase in psychological distress and mental health difficulties. Indeed, the general well-being of the Australian population is showing signs of strain, irrespective of the impacts of COVID-19. This is shown on the worth domain of the Australian Cohesion Index. On the 2022 Mapping Social Cohesion survey, around half of us reported feeling isolated from others some or all of the time. 78% said they've been happy over the last year. And while this proportion has been reasonably stable since 2019, the survey detected a modest decline in happiness over the last 10 years. Social cohesion is closely connected to happiness and personal well-being, contributing to the important social environment and the supports that allow us to thrive. As was shown in the 2022 Mapping Social Cohesion report, people who are unhappy, feel isolated from others, or feel they're not treated with respect report a substantially lower sense of belonging in Australia and in their communities, a weaker sense of social inclusion and justice, weaker trust in the federal government, and less acceptance of people from different backgrounds. Inequalities in health and well-being across Australia are in turn a source of strain on social cohesion. Some progress has been made to close the gap in Indigenous life expectancy, though we're falling short of our targets. And gaps also exist for disadvantaged communities. Migrant Australians generally report good health and well-being, at least on average. However, migrant and diverse communities were most impacted by COVID-19, faced with much higher rates of infection and death. So it's been a mixed story overall. We have our challenges, a declining sense of belonging and participation in our communities, cost of living pressures contributing to financial hardships, and growing concern for economic inequality, and inequality in health, well-being, and cohesion. We're having difficult debates and division in our political arena. On the positive side, though, we are more likely to be engaged in the labour market than ever before. We live longer than ever before. We're increasingly accepting of our differences and diversity, and our society was remarkably resilient throughout the pandemic. In fact, our bonds strengthened during the crisis, and we remain connected, and we have an opportunity to strengthen those connections. So I leave it with Peter Mayers again to bookend my remarks today. Matilda-mania shows how much our nation has changed and can change again. It shows that we are connected as citizens. We dare to dream big for the Matildas, and we should dare to dream big for our nation's future too. That's all from me. Before I finish, my huge thanks to all those involved in the production of the Australian Cohesion Index, particularly my co-authors, Ching, Trish, and Ruben. That's all from me. On behalf of all of us, thank you for your time and interest. I look forward to engaging with you more on this important topic. All the best.
Don't disappear just yet, James. Thank you very much for that. And it is quite extraordinary how much depth of information you've managed to get into that presentation. But at the same time, there is so much more within the report itself. So I do encourage people to go and read it thoroughly and very much to enjoy the flow of the chapters. They really do help to pull all of these data points together. James, there is one question, though, that has come through, which is just about how we go about calculating the percentage metrics. And I just wondered whether or not you might like to just respond to that before we move on.
Yes, so it's reasonably straightforward. For some indicators, an increase is a good thing. So, for example, happiness, the happier they are, the better it is. And so that's a sign of progress. So we can calculate a percentage change from 1 year to to the previous time point. So in some cases, 2022 to 2007. In some cases, on some of their indicators, an increase is a bad thing. So rent stress, for example. So an increase in rent stress, we consider a bad thing. So to measure progress on something like rent stress, we want to see a decline in rent stress. So it's a slightly different calculation where we're sort of inverting it a little bit to try and say that actual upward progress is actually a decline in rent stress. So there's some special calculations in how we calculate whether progress based on whether indicators should be going up and down to achieve good progress.
Thanks, James. There is a lot more explanation in the report as well. So if people want to get further into depth, they can certainly read that there. Now, multi-award winning infectious diseases specialist Dr. Kudzai Kanhutu has received national recognition for her contribution to health equity initiatives. She has a particular interest in technical solutions to health problems from her experience of health innovation in both Zimbabwe and working in rural and regional Australia. Kudzai, welcome. We'd be delighted, especially since where we ended was talking about health and wellbeing. It'd be really great to get your views that came out of how you read the information at the time and wrote your expert commentary, but also now thinking of some of the questions that have been coming through do relate to health and wellbeing.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anthea, and thank you to the Scanlon Foundation team for inviting me to be part of this forum. In that invitation, I actually was reminded of the first time I encountered the Australian Cohesion Index in the report. At the time, I believe we were working on a report on migrant and refugee women's health outcomes and trying to set some basic standards around what are best practices for that particular cohort of patients or people who use health services. And I myself and other clinicians had come to that forum with a real expectation that we were going to be tasked with speaking about the coalface of healthcare, what happens in clinics and in hospitals across the countryside, and how we're contending with that dynamic. But on the day that you presented that particular year's report, I remember a sense of expansion in the room where people really took pause for thought and reflected on the reality that a lot of the work that we do in healthcare has so much more to do with what happens outside of that clinical environment. It has to do with the bus journey that the person took to get to the clinic, the travel that they had, the workplaces they inhabit, their educational environment, the homes that they live in or do not live in. And that's what we were really being tasked with contending with. How do we respond to that? So what I've come to see the Australian Cohesion Report as is actually a diagnostic tool, and how we work to embed those teachings and those learnings into the way we respond to healthcare need, whether it's during the pandemic or in response to psychological distress. And look, as with any diagnostic tool, and I'd consider the ACI as actually being a population level health diagnostic tool as opposed to a patient one. It allows us to see trends in social determinants of health. And in doing that, it also asks the greater question, which is if you're seeing that even though people, 86% of people reported that they have excellent, good, or very good health, but a third of those people also say that they felt a lack of trust during COVID, or that a third of youth say that they don't feel a sense of Australian belonging, or there's a high level of psychological distress. What do you actually do with those trends? So as a diagnostic tool, how I've taken or conceived of these findings is to say to myself, the height of, unethical behaviour as a health and wellbeing practitioner is to see a trend or to do a test and then not respond, because the diagnostic test is not the be-all and end-all, it is the beginning of an inquiry that then asks you, well, what is your therapeutic intervention? So above all, I'm really fascinated to learn in this forum what people do see as being the therapeutic interventions. What is the therapeutic intervention if you see that a particular group within our society is experiencing a sense of disenfranchisement, distrust with local government or government at large, and what are the levers that we have? So I'm really reassured that at least in this forum, we've brought together people from across the sector who within their own scopes of practice have very different levers with which to lever and also contribute to what I think is the goal of a greater sense of social cohesion and well-being, whether it's policymakers, economists, academics, who all have in their own way some play to part a part to play in order to achieve that greater goal. So I'll leave it at that, really, other than to say that thank you so much for contributing to such a rigorous body of works that, in my mind, has really expanded and extended my concept of what are the boundaries of clinical care provision and how we as healthcare workers can look to other pods of expertise in order to understand the context within which our patients inhabit and how we can support them better. So I'll end with thanks for all of the work that you're doing and the continuity of the excellence in the delivery of the work as well.
Thank you, Kudzai. It does make such an important point that every element within society has an effect on somebody's well-being and their own responses to that come out through a health perspective. So an incredibly important point. But not only that, as I introduced Kate Reynolds, who's going to talk a little bit about the belonging component, it's that broad sense of your relationship to Australian society and to your neighbourhoods that makes an enormous difference. Now, Professor Kate Reynolds has, for the past 2 decades, investigated the developments in understanding how the transformation of social identity and connecting with new, meaningful others is related to social and behaviour change. And Kate, I'd love to hear a little bit about your comments related to the Australian Cohesion Index and what we can learn from it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the commentary in the index and to be here today. The report, this report, and also the Mapping Social Cohesion report are some of the main ways in which we come to understand our social and political fabric. And they play a vital role in terms of us understanding ourselves and how we are going as a society. I guess in my commentary, I was very focused on this idea that this is a pivotal time for Australia, that we can see much to be proud of when we look at some of the absolute levels in terms of the responses in this report. But we can also see that there are declines across time. And so for me, these declines really are alarm bells that really should motivate us towards, yes, better diagnosis, but also finding better treatments and doing that with some urgency, because we don't know we don't really have a lot of information about the thresholds that if we fall below, it may not be possible to recover and sort of future-proof the sort of prosperity of Australia going forward. So what we do know is that social cohesion is vital for prosperity. We know that society functions effectively, democracies function effectively where there is social cohesion. And yet in this report, we see on a number of indicators, including with respect to belonging and engagement, a decline over time. Some people might argue that that decline is to do with issues of measurement or issues of the frame of reference that people are using when they make those assessments. But what we saw during COVID was actually that those declines were halted and in some cases reversed. So I think for me, that gives me more confidence that these kind of measures are sensitive to the social and political life, and that we should be taking these declines very seriously and working to try and find some solutions to strengthen social cohesion, including in the area of connection and belonging. And we need to do so with some urgency. So in the commentary, I look to some solutions, and by no means is it providing us a comprehensive list, but the kind of things that I briefly discuss are that we can look to what worked during COVID, because during COVID, we did see a strengthening of social cohesion. And so some of the things that we saw during COVID around leadership, around governance, around addressing inequality are sort of summarised in the commentary. We also had leadership on show during COVID, where there was effort put into explaining, connecting, communicating with the Australian population about what we were doing well, how we were doing it, what we needed to do, establishing some of those consensus and community-wide norms around how we should think about ourselves and our circumstance. I also note that the public service is a potential catalyst for connection and a sense of respect and being valued amongst the Australian population, and that perhaps thinking of the role of the public service in that way could be important in strengthening social cohesion. And I'm now at an education faculty at the University of Melbourne, and there's been lots of work and discussion about schools as a really vital piece of having a very vital place in the community that can be used to build connection and cohesion. So, you know, that's a beginning place, I guess, for this discussion. But certainly, for me, it's a pivotal moment. There is urgency. We do need to plan in a strategic way a response to what's in this report, and hopefully this forum and the report itself will drive some of those conversations forward.
Thank you very much, Kate. And so I should say to everybody that the way we're going to deal with the questions is that I'll put the question to the panel and anybody is welcome to answer it. And not unexpectedly, really, we have had a question about what are the suggested proactive actions that can be taken to impact racism. Any thoughts from anybody? I'm sure you've all got thoughts about exactly what you think we should be doing as a society and as individuals to try and reduce the experience of racism and discrimination. Who would like to go first?
Ken?
Go, Kate.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a really important question, and we see some indications here and also in the Mapping Social Cohesion report of experiences of discrimination also increasing. And I guess for me, you know, a really important mindset for the Australian population more broadly is what kind of community do we want to step up and try and create for ourselves and for the future. And I think that part of that is moving towards a very active idea of what really individuals are going to be doing to actually learn, behave, change the way in which they're interacting with others to maximise the sense that everyone can feel that they belong and part of the Australian community. Obviously, there are more specific initiatives for particular places and groups, but when we think about the community as a whole, I think that there is something motivating about active attempts to engage effectively with one another.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. Kudzai, any thoughts?
Yes, look, this is something I think you and I have spoken about before, and it goes to the heart of how we envisage ourselves as a society and who looks the part and who doesn't. And I think we've spoken about how this plays out in the way Australia projects a vision of itself externally to the world. And it is typically one that is can be a little bit archetypal, you know, very prototypical vision, you know, somebody on a surf beach surfing and then, you know, some First Nations art thrown in. And I think that really devalues the richness of the history, the cultural heritage and the legacy that we have through First Nations, and also what modern Australia looks like. So there's some real moments of pause to think about who are we as a nation and how do we want to actually get comfortable with who we are as a nation, as opposed to reverting back to old versions of what, you know, the other people outside of Australia are expecting. And I think there's been a comment made before that has stuck with me that often, you know, parts of Australia can suffer from high levels of low-level racism. And what I mean by that is that it's casualised racism, it's microaggressions, it's things that sort of give you pause for thought and you think, oh, was that okay or was it not? And what we're currently lacking in that debate is how do we teach people to respond in the moment and to provide some of that bystander response. What do I do? What do I say if I hear something that doesn't quite sound right, but I just need some guidance? And that's, I think, where we need to get to. It's about building that dialogue and the level of confidence that allows someone to ask, was that offensive? And if it was, what do we do next with that so that it doesn't happen again? And that becomes a very comfortable conversation to have.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're questioning it, chances are it was. Thank you, Kudzai. James, there is a question. It's an interesting turn of phrase. It says, how responsive is the index in the face of structural challenges, accessibility, equity issues, particularly across regional, rural and remote areas in Australia?
Yeah. So we're able to provide some indicators at a sort of regional level and across the country. Most of our indicators are well, some of them are only available at the national level. Certainly with the Mapping Social Cohesion survey and the fact that it's been running now for a good 16 years, we can track those changes over time and come up with some really sort of fine-grained analyses on how things are responding to changes in society. And so that's such an incredible resource and such a valuable resource. And hopefully we'll be able to do more of that with some of our other, I guess, more substantive outcomes as well, and look at how changes in those indicators have changed over time and what then are the implications for social cohesion.
Just while I've got you, James, as if you can go anywhere, there are a couple of questions related to COVID. One is that the data reveals that people who were born overseas, they had increased risk of dying during COVID-19. But then there's also another question which sort of relates to the increase in the level of trust that occurred during COVID. So that for some particular communities, that was not necessarily the way they experienced things. Do you want to sort of perhaps talk to those two different areas?
Yes, certainly. And so the incredible resource has been the Australian Bureau of Statistics provisional mortality statistics, which has sort of tracked deaths almost near real time, not quite real time, but in much faster than it had been previously across Australia during the pandemic. And they were able to show some of the impacts on different groups and showing that particularly some people that arrived here from specific regions and countries did have higher death rates from COVID-19, and some of the work, including some of the work that Kate and I have done together, has shown that some of the diverse communities certainly had high rates of infection. Their local economies were hard hit by the pandemic, and what we show is that none of this is related to anything about sort of cultural practices or anything of this nature, or civil disobedience or not following the regulations or anything like that. It was to do with sort of structural concerns and constraints, and the fact that people in some of these communities were particularly exposed through their work and through their particularly through their work and their sort of economic situation. And so that increase in trust, it was quite strong outside of diverse communities and outside of people who have arrived here, particularly from non-English speaking backgrounds. So that's a real concern about that, whether that was, that galvanizing effect from the pandemic was equally shared across the society, or whether it potentially opened up some cleavages that we really need to address and follow up on.
Thanks, James. Kudzai and Kate, there is a question which talks about assumptions that we make about participation and what it actually looks like in an inclusive and diverse society. Have you got any thoughts about how we go about talking about participation and whether or not we're potentially making some assumptions about what that looks like that doesn't necessarily take in the diversity of the population? So Kudzai, any thoughts?
Yeah, so is that in reference to political participation or just?
I think it's participation in general, but you can split it up if you like.
When I think about participation, if you look at it from a health perspective, my goal is always for people to feel like they have a sense of comfort, confidence, and trust when they choose to participate, not that they must. So regardless of the context, it comes down to, for an individual person, if they are consider themselves as being diverse, how comfortable would they feel turning up to their local member of parliament and being heard? Or is there a part of them that feels that they may not be welcome because there is not the permissive environment that actually says your views are important and they deserve to be heard, and we can have that meaningful dialogue? So I think that again speaks to the concept of representation and mirroring our services and places of engagement and participation in a way that make people feel as though they will be genuinely welcome. And in hospitals, we try and put a lot of effort there, but still a lot of our contexts are still very Anglophone. If you don't speak English, good luck. And I see the minister has arrived. Wonderful. Well, I think on that note, we might just, now that he's arrived, that is my perspective. I think it's about having people feel that they'll actually be welcome when they choose to participate, rather than they must participate in all things.
Absolutely, and thank you. Minister, we are incredibly pleased that you're here, given that I had heard that there was a good chance that you might not be here. So given that you're dashing from one place to another, you can either take a moment to breathe, or if you'd like to actually start speaking now, we're more than happy to make that time.
Anthea, thank you very much. And I'm very sorry to have inconvenienced the panel, and particularly, I think it was, I hope I haven't interrupted Kutsai's presentation, but I might just jump in because an airline that isn't the usual suspect has interfered in the progress of my day quite a bit. So I'm very sorry that I'm on my phone at Hobart Airport, which is probably not ideal. But I might, if that's okay. So
absolutely.
I'd like to begin my remarks by acknowledging the Mawinia people, the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm joining you today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm very proud to be part of a government that is committed to recognising all of our diversity. The government will give every Australian the opportunity to vote yes for recognition, listening, and better results on the 14th of October too. I want to thank the many of you here who have contributed to this national conversation so far. And what a great honour it is for me to be with you, albeit a little late, to launch the first standalone publication of the biannual Australian Cohesion Index, a project backed by the federal government, both in funding but also in broader support. Through this, we are taking the pulse of the Australian community against a range of themes so that we can better understand how we are and how we're getting on together as a society. How united and how connected are we, or are we not? Now, social cohesion is much spoken about, but not easily understood unless it's measured. And we know that long-term data-driven analysis of issues affecting migrant and multicultural communities, including social cohesion, has been sorely lacking for too long. Today's report includes data ranging from as early as 2006 through to last year, capturing some long-term trends as well as our recovery from the worst of the pandemic and the early impacts of more recent events. And there's a lot of good news that is contained in this year's report. I'm pleased to say that support for migrant diversity as a way to make Australia stronger has increased steadily in the last 15 years. It's up by almost 20% than when we compare it from 2007. And almost 50% more people now agree that cultural minorities should receive a helping hand from government in order to maintain customs and traditions. Some findings, however, should give us all pause. Our sense of national pride alongside community involvement has decreased. It's back to its lowest level since 2007. Alarmingly, levels of belonging and a sense of social justice are now lower than they were before the pandemic. COVID provided us all with a salient example of the dire impacts of our social cohesion where government fails to engage with or to properly understand culturally and linguistically diverse communities. Who can forget when migrants were told to go home? Who can forget when Google Translate was relied upon to translate vital health communications? Perhaps most shameful of all was when the former government was nowhere to be seen when racial vilification of Asian Australians grew during the pandemic. In the first part of 2020, the Human Rights Commission reported that around a quarter of people who lodged complaints of racial discrimination were targeted because of COVID-19. The Albanese government is taking this seriously and taking action. If we're to learn from the failures of the pandemic, government must ensure that public services, agencies and service providers constantly build their cultural competence and understanding. But over the last 50 years, we haven't fully taken stock of how these government bodies support and indeed may fail to support multicultural communities across Australia. Accordingly, the Albanese government's Multicultural Framework Review will evaluate the effectiveness of existing policies and programs in promoting social inclusion, respect for diversity too, and will identify areas for improvement. I'm focusing in this regard on drawing on the talents who know these issues firsthand. And that's why we've appointed a panel of 3 eminent multicultural community leaders to travel the country and engage with and speak with as many Australians as they can before providing a report and recommendations to me early next year. I'm really pleased to have joined in some of these community consultations from Melbourne all the way up to Darwin, to hear directly from communities and to see firsthand what today's report also lays out. Now, this government's vision for multicultural Australia is one where we are all able to harness the talents of our diversity, where every Australian belongs and feels that they belong everywhere. The research that's being presented today provides us with invaluable insight into how Australians want us to go about harnessing this diversity. And I congratulate the Foundation on the work leading up to it and, of course, on its release. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and we're delighted that you managed to pop in even just for a few minutes. So thank you very much. Enjoy your time in Tasmania.
Thanks, Anthea. I think we can listen for a bit longer, so hopefully I'll hear something worthwhile while I catch my breath.
Absolutely. Kudza, I don't know whether you'd finished commenting before. Did you want to say anything more?
No, that's fine.
I might actually just go to James, because one of the questions that came through related to how the effect of the impact of global events that are happening. James, how do you see that playing out in the index itself? The inflation, the war, the various things that are happening globally. Are we seeing impacts of that on our respondents and on the data?
I think we're seeing that Australia is resilient, and cohesion in Australia is resilient to some of these big world challenges. That's not to say they don't affect, and they do affect, particularly given the fact that we have such a diverse society with people drawn from all corners of the world and facing some of these pressures. Cost of living pressures have undoubtedly had an impact, and financial pressures are the strongest predictor of many of our cohesion outcomes, particularly in terms of trust and belonging. So having a sort of sound financial situation is important kind of foundation for our social cohesion. But as I say, so we've been tracking these events, particularly in the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey, and people's attitudes to them. So people are very concerned about things like global recession. They have been concerned around some of the geopolitical tensions, especially Australia-China relations. But as I say, it's so there are lots weighing on the minds of Australians and global citizens everywhere. To date, though, I think we should take some time to reflect on the fact that we haven't quite seen that same degree of polarization and division within society around some of these issues. So that's not something to take for granted by any means, but something to reflect on and think, what are we doing right, and how can we keep strengthening that and keep going.
Thanks, James. Kate, there seems to be a difference between how people feel a sense of belonging within their neighbourhoods and a sense of belonging to Australia as a whole. Have you got any thoughts about why that might be the case?
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think what we see is, for most people, there is still quite a high connection to their local communities. So I think if we're thinking about ways to strengthen social cohesion, then those local communities could play quite a vital role. There's also some suggestions in the data that young people may not feel that sense of connection with their local community as much as older people. And that could well be because young people are connecting in different kinds of ways that aren't so place-based. Or, if we understood that better, it might be that different kinds of things need to happen in the local community to strengthen that sense of belonging and connection. When we've looked at people's connection to the nation and connection to the neighbourhood, and what was important in driving much of their health behaviour during COVID, it really was, both of those things could be important under different circumstances. So I would argue that strengthening both is important if we're trying to strengthen people's social cohesion and everything that flows from social cohesion in a way downstream, which I would argue are things like wellbeing, trust, confidence in participating broadly in society, volunteering. All of these things are are captured by spending time trying to strengthen social cohesion.
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought just before we've got a few minutes to go anyway, I did think that the participants might be quite interested in getting some advice from you as to what they should be doing on the ground in order to strengthen social cohesion from any one of these perspectives. So, Kudzai, do you have any thoughts about how should we go about strengthening social cohesion across the population and within our neighbourhoods as well?
This is fundamentally a relational question, and it's about looking at yourself and considering the relationships you have with other people and with places. We've just spoken about the importance of local community supports and infrastructure, and thinking about how we engage with them individually and even as families. So I would just ask people to do a stock take of the relationships they have and to really check the quality of them and to consider how they help to enhance them, because we cannot all be all things to all people, but every day you're meeting with people, and every single one of those interactions can be the difference between somebody feeling welcomed, because social cohesion is ultimately a sense of welcome. Do I feel welcomed when I exit my door in the morning, and do I feel seen and heard? So stock take your relationships and think about how you can cultivate them in ways that actually help to bridge connection and to allow people to feel welcome into your space, and that you can continue that as a positive dialogue that allows you to learn also from others. Yeah, thank you, Kudzai. James, maybe you could reflect on the same thing about how do we build trust at that sort of local level? Is it all about our personal interactions, or is there more to it?
I think there's lots of things we can do in it, and it's quite multidimensional, isn't it? About the sort of foundational things we need to have in place. So, sort of a sound sort of personal and financial and material well-being, opportunities for contact and relationships within our communities, sort of whether it be organised activities, green spaces, a whole range of, and seeing these things in community design and community life is sort of a holistic experience in which we're sort of supporting and creating those opportunities for contact and contact that's meaningful, that's on respectful and equal grounds, and is sort of mutually beneficial as well.
Kate, there was Peter Mayer's essay references the Matildas. Have you got a thought about what the Matilda-mania actually did express about Australia's social cohesiveness, and what that says about where we can go if we think about what we can do as a population in strengthening social cohesion?
Yeah, there's a lot to be proud of, isn't there? I mean, when we see that, Australia at its best, coming together to have sort of pride and engagement with others in those kind of sporting fields. And of course, sport is seen to be a really important way to build connection and to build social cohesion. I think that, I do think that we're at, as I've said, we're at a critical time. So whatever happens going forward, I think it needs to be part of a clear strategy, a deliberate plan. On a number of occasions, myself and colleagues have called for a Minister of Social Cohesion, specifically because it's so critical to our future. So I think it's about learning from those moments. Why did they work so well? And trying to embed it into a longer-term deliberate plan to actually strengthen the social and political fabric in Australia, and to do that with some purpose and urgency. And obviously this report and the Minister sort of being here is all hopefully part of a more deliberate effort going forward around those things.
Absolutely. Minister, I imagine that you might like to comment on that, and especially since you are currently in the midst of the developing the multicultural framework and undertaking that review. Have you got any thoughts about what you would like to see across the population to strengthen social cohesion?
Yeah, well, it's a very big question. I should say that at the outset, while I definitely hear where Kate's coming from, I'll leave the design and allocation of portfolios to the Prime Minister. But I think what we see in this report is a really clear sense of, I guess, unease that goes to both the people's sense of national belonging, distinct from a more localised sense, and people's faith in government's capacity to instil that sense of belonging. And how that is to be responded to is something that national government and indeed state and territory governments need to take very, very seriously, particularly when we look at what the data showed us in the height of the pandemic period, where we saw particularly a significant uptick in people's faith in politics and political institutions. So I think, again, I tried to touch briefly from a multicultural community's perspective, how we ensure that the hard-won lessons of the pandemic are embedded into practice. I think that needs to not simply be a factor of how diverse communities are engaged with and listened to by government. It's something that has to be a broader systems-based approach.
Thank you very much, Minister, and my sincere thanks to you for your words and for the contribution of the Department of Home Affairs in bringing together the Australian Cohesion Index. I would actually like to thank everybody that's been here today, but in particular, of course, Dr. James O'Donnell, Dr. Kudzai Kanhutu, and Professor Kate Reynolds. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you all here, and of course to have the Minister join us and to share some of your thoughts with us as well. I would like to thank everybody that's been here today. I look forward to seeing you all again in November when we bring you the 2023 results of the Mapping Social Cohesion Survey. But in the meantime, please interrogate the microsite and enjoy the report. We're very, very proud of it. Thank you all very much.